You ever think about what happens when everything goes wrong, but somehow you end up exactly where you need to be? At 11:47 p.m. on June 5, 1944, Private First Class James Dalton jumped out of a C-47 Dakota transport aircraft into complete darkness over Nazi-occupied France. He was supposed to land with his unit 2 miles inland from Utah Beach. Instead, he landed 15 miles off target, completely alone, with no idea where he was. That mistake saved thousands of American lives. The 101st Airborne Division's jump into Normandy on D-Day Eve was supposed to be precise. Months of planning, detailed maps, specific drop zones. Every trooper knew exactly where they were supposed to land and what they were supposed to do when they got there. Secure bridges, block roads, disrupt German reinforcements, clear the way for the beach landings at dawn. But war doesn't care about plans. Jimmy Dalton was 23 years old from a farm outside Toledo, Ohio. Before the war, he'd worked as an electrician's apprentice, fixed farm equipment, wired barns, understood how electrical systems worked. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army made him a rifleman. Didn't care that he knew anything about electricity, just handed him an M1 Garand and taught him how to jump out of airplanes. Dalton's stick of paratroopers loaded onto their C-47 at 22:30 hours on June 5th at an airfield in southern England. 16 men, full combat gear, reserve parachute strapped to the chest, main chute on the back, rifle bag strapped to the leg, ammunition, grenades, rations. Each man carried about 120 pounds of equipment. They could barely walk, let alone fight. The jump master was Sergeant Frank Morrison, 32 years old, veteran of North Africa and Sicily. Morrison had made 6 combat jumps. He knew what worked and what didn't. He walked down the line of paratroopers doing final checks, tightened straps, checked static lines, looked each man in the eye. When he got to Dalton, he stopped. "You good, Jimmy?" "Yeah, Sarge. Good to go." Morrison nodded. "Remember, when you hit the ground, don't think. Just move. Get to the rally point. Find friendly forces. Don't try to be a hero." Dalton said he understood, but he had no idea that in about 3 hours he'd be doing exactly what Morrison told him not to do. The C-47s took off at 23:15 hours. Over 800 aircraft carrying 13,000 paratroopers, the largest airborne operation in history. The planes flew in tight formation at 500 feet altitude to avoid German radar. The weather was terrible. Low clouds, wind, rain. Visibility was almost zero. Inside Dalton's C-47, nobody talked. The engines were too loud. The aircraft shook and bounced in the turbulence. Some men were praying, some were sleeping, some just stared at nothing. Dalton checked his equipment for the 10th time. Static line secure, reserve chute pin safety wired, rifle bag attached properly. Everything correct. At 23:42 hours, the red light came on. 6 minutes to jump. Morrison stood up, hooked his static line to the cable running down the center of the aircraft. The other 15 paratroopers did the same. They stood in 2 lines facing the open door. The wind howled through the opening. The temperature inside the aircraft dropped instantly. Morrison yelled over the engine noise, "Check equipment!" Each man checked the parachute of the man in front of him. Dalton felt hands tugging on his straps, checking his static line connection. He did the same for the trooper in front of him. Everything tight, everything correct. Then the aircraft started taking fire. Dalton heard it before he saw it, a sound like gravel hitting a tin roof. Tracer rounds from the ground punching through the thin aluminum skin of the C-47. Holes appeared in the fuselage. Wind screamed through them. The aircraft jerked hard left as the pilot took evasive action. The green light came on. Jump time. Morrison didn't hesitate. He went out the door. The rest of the stick followed, 1-second intervals, man after man disappearing into the darkness. Dalton was number 12 in the stick. He shuffled forward, hands on the sides of the door, wind blasting his face. Below him, nothing but black, no ground visible, no reference points, just darkness. He jumped. The prop blast from the C-47's engines hit him like a wall, spun him sideways. The static line yanked his main chute open. The canopy deployed with a crack that he felt through his entire body. And then sudden, shocking silence. The aircraft noise was gone, just wind and darkness and the sound of his own breathing. Dalton looked up. His canopy was open and round. Good deployment. He looked down. Still couldn't see the ground. Too dark. He reached down and released his rifle bag, letting it drop on the 15-foot tether so it would hit the ground before he did, and he'd have both hands free for the landing. He counted. 1001, 1002, 1003. Still no ground visible. 1004, 1005. Where was the... He hit. Not the soft French farmland he'd been briefed on. He hit water. Cold, dark water that closed over his head instantly. The weight of his equipment dragged him down. He couldn't see anything. Didn't know which way was up. The parachute was collapsing on top of him, pulling him deeper. Dalton fought panic. His training took over. He pulled his reserve chute release, let go. Started pulling himself hand over hand up his risers toward where the parachute canopy was. Found the edge of the canopy, pulled himself out from under it, broke the surface, gasped for air. He was in a river or a stream. Current was strong. His equipment was pulling him under. He hit the quick release on his main parachute harness. It dropped away. He kicked off his boots, got his head above water long enough to see trees on both sides. The current swept him downstream. He fought the current for maybe 2 minutes before his hand hit something solid, a tree branch hanging into the water. He grabbed it, pulled himself toward the bank. Got his hands on mud and grass, dragged himself out of the water, lay on the bank gasping and shaking. His rifle was gone. Lost with the rifle bag. His reserve chute was gone. All his ammunition was gone. All he had left was the M1911 pistol in his shoulder holster, 2 grenades on his harness, and a combat knife. That's it. No radio. No food. No map, soaking wet, lost, alone. Somewhere in Nazi-occupied France. It was 0017 hours on June 6, 1944. D-Day had begun, and Private First Class Jimmy Dalton had absolutely no idea where he was. The first thing he needed was to figure out his location. The briefing had shown them aerial photos of the drop zones. Hedgerows, small fields, Norman farmland. This didn't look like any of that. He was in a wooded area next to a river. The trees were taller than the hedgerows in the briefing photos. The terrain was wrong. Dalton moved away from the river into the tree line, found a spot where he could see in multiple directions, listened. In the distance, he could hear aircraft engines, could hear explosions, the sound of war. But it was far away, miles away, not close like it should have been if he'd landed near his drop zone. He was lost, badly lost. The training said if you're separated from your unit, find a road. Roads lead to towns. Towns have landmarks. You can figure out where you are from landmarks. Then you navigate to your rally point or find friendly forces. Simple. Dalton started walking, picked a direction that felt like away from the river and started moving. He moved slow and careful. Every 50 yards he stopped and listened. The woods were dark and quiet. No Germans, no Americans, no French civilians. Just him and the trees and the darkness. After about 20 minutes, he found a dirt road, not a main road, a farm track, but it was something. He followed it, staying in the tree line parallel to the road, not walking on it. Walking on roads at night gets you shot. The road led to a field. On the far side of the field, maybe 400 yards away, he could see a structure. Something big, something that didn't belong in a farmer's field. It had lights. Not a lot of lights, just a few dim ones. And it had a shape he recognized from his training. It was a radar installation. Dalton had seen photos during intelligence briefings. The Germans had built coastal radar stations all along the Atlantic Wall. They used them to detect Allied aircraft and ships, early warning systems. The briefing said the radar stations were heavily defended. German radar crews were technical specialists. They had guards. They had communications. They were dangerous. Every instinct told Dalton to avoid it. Morrison's voice in his head, "Don't try to be a hero. Find friendly forces. Get back to your unit. That's the mission, not attacking German installations by yourself with just a pistol and 2 grenades." But something made him stop. Made him look at that radar installation more carefully. And that's when he realized something that changed everything. The radar was pointing the wrong direction. Dalton knew radars, had studied electrical systems, had read about German radar technology in his briefings. German coastal radars pointed toward the sea. They scanned for ships and aircraft coming from the water. That's their job. Early warning of invasion. This radar was pointing inland, away from the coast. That didn't make sense unless he was east of invasion beaches, unless he'd jumped so far off target that he'd landed behind the coastal defenses. And this radar installation was scanning for aircraft coming from inland France. It was part of the German defensive network covering their rear areas, which meant this radar was probably tracking the Allied transport aircraft that were still dropping paratroopers. This radar was helping German anti-aircraft batteries shoot down C-47s full of American soldiers. Dalton did the math in his head. If he was 15 miles off target and the drop zones were 2 miles inland from Utah Beach, that put him 13 miles behind the planned front line, deep in German territory. And this radar was probably one of the most important installations in this sector because it was covering the German rear areas during the exact hours when thousands of Allied paratroopers were landing. He had a choice: walk away, try to find his unit, do what Morrison told him to do, or try to take out this radar station with almost no weapons and no support. It was a stupid choice, suicide choice. But Dalton was an electrician before he was a soldier, and he understood something that most soldiers didn't. You don't have to blow up a radar to kill it. You just have to kill its power supply. He made his decision. He was going to take out that radar station. The installation was surrounded by a fence, chain link, maybe 8 feet tall, 3 guard towers. Dalton counted 6 Germans that he could see. 2 guards walking the perimeter, 2 in the towers, 2 inside working on the radar. There might be more inside the buildings. The radar itself was a Würzburg Riese. Dalton recognized it from training photos. Big parabolic dish, maybe 7 meters across, mounted on a rotating platform. Beautiful engineering, complex electrical system, and somewhere nearby, a power generator or transformer that fed electricity to the whole installation. Dalton worked his way around the perimeter, staying in the trees, watching the guard patterns. The guards were bored. They weren't expecting trouble this far from the coast. They walked their routes mechanically. Predictable timing. One guard passed the same section of fence every 12 minutes. At 02:45 hours, Dalton made his move. He waited until the guard passed his section of fence, counted to 60, ran to the fence, climbed it. The chain link rattled but not loud enough to alert anyone. He dropped down on the other side, moved toward the nearest building. The building was the equipment shed, unlocked. Inside he found tools, spare parts, and what he was looking for, cable diagrams for the radar system. The Germans kept detailed technical documentation. Dalton pulled out the diagrams and studied them by the light of his Zippo lighter, found the power distribution system, traced it back to the source. The main power transformer was in a separate building 50 yards from the radar dish. That was his target. Kill the transformer, kill the radar. The radar had backup batteries, but they'd only last maybe 30 minutes, long enough for the Germans to try to fix the problem, but not long enough to matter for the invasion. Dalton moved toward the transformer building. This one was locked. He tried the door. Solid. He needed another way in. He circled the building, found a window on the back side, 8 feet up. He used a drainage pipe to climb. The window was latched but old. He used his knife to work the latch through the gap. It opened. He climbed through the window into darkness, dropped down onto a concrete floor, waited for his eyes to adjust. The room was full of electrical equipment, transformers, junction boxes, cable runs, and in the center, the main power distribution panel. Dalton knew transformers, knew exactly where to hit them to cause maximum damage. He didn't need explosives. He needed to create a short circuit that would overload the system, fry the transformer from the inside, make it look like an electrical failure, not sabotage. He found a metal tool cabinet. Inside were wire cutters and insulated gloves. He put on the gloves, opened the main distribution panel. Inside were 3 massive bus bars carrying power from the transformer to different parts of the installation. The radar system, the communication system, the lighting system. Dalton used the wire cutters to strip insulation off 2 cables, bare copper wire. He took one of his grenades, removed the pin, held the spoon down, carefully wedged the grenade between the 2 exposed wires, making sure the metal body of the grenade would bridge the gap when the spoon released it. Then he ran. He got out through the window, dropped to the ground, started running toward the fence. Behind him, he heard the grenade detonate, not a loud explosion, muffled, inside the transformer building. Then a much louder sound, the transformer exploding, electrical arcing, sparks shooting into the night sky. Every light in the installation went dark. Dalton kept running, made it to the fence, climbed, got to the top, dropped down on the other side, rolled, came up running. Behind him, Germans were shouting, flashlights sweeping. Somebody fired a rifle. The bullet went wide. They couldn't see him in the darkness. He made it to the tree line, kept running for another 200 yards, then stopped. turned around. Watched. The radar dish was completely dark, not rotating, not scanning, dead. The transformer building was burning, flames visible through the windows. Germans were running everywhere with fire extinguishers. But the damage was done. That transformer wouldn't be repaired tonight, maybe not for days. Dalton had just knocked out one of the most important German radar installations in Normandy, by himself, with a grenade and some electrical knowledge, and the Germans thought it was an equipment failure. He started walking, needed to find friendly forces before daylight. The invasion beaches were west. He could hear the sound of naval gunfire in that direction now. Big guns, battleships bombarding the coast. The invasion was starting. At 0420 hours, Dalton found a road, a real road, paved, at west, staying in the shadows. After about a mile, he heard American voices, paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne. They'd secured a crossroads and were digging in. A lieutenant challenged him, demanded the password. Dalton gave it. The lieutenant looked him over, soaking wet. No rifle, no gear, just a pistol and one grenade left. "Where's your unit, Private?" "Lost them in the jump, sir. Landed in a river about 15 miles east of here." 15 miles? Jesus, you walked 15 miles through German territory? "Yes, sir." "See any Germans?" Dalton thought about the radar installation, thought about telling the lieutenant what he'd done, then decided against it. They'd think he was crazy or lying. Nobody would believe that one private took out a radar station by himself. "Saw some patrols, sir. Avoided them." The lieutenant assigned him to a squad that was short a man. Gave him a rifle from a dead German. Dalton joined the defensive perimeter, and for the rest of D-Day, he fought like every other paratrooper. Defended crossroads, fought off German counterattacks, did his job. But something was different on Utah Beach that morning. The German response was confused, disorganized. Their coastal radar had detected the invasion fleet, but their inland radar network had holes in it. They couldn't track the airborne forces accurately, couldn't coordinate their anti-aircraft fire properly. More C-47s got through than expected. More paratroopers landed successfully. The invasion planners had expected 30% casualties among the airborne forces. The actual number was 21%. Nobody could figure out why the Germans had been so ineffective with their air defenses during those critical hours. Years later, a military historian researching D-Day found German records from June 6, 1944. Found references to a radar station near Sainte-Mère-Église that had suffered a catastrophic electrical failure at 0248 hours, right before the main paratrooper landings. The failure had created a gap in German radar coverage that lasted for 6 hours. The Germans never figured out what caused it. Their technical report concluded it was probably a power surge from the transformer. The historian tried to correlate the radar failure with Allied operations, checked mission reports, checked sabotage operations, found nothing. No Allied commandos had been anywhere near that radar station. No airstrikes had hit it. It just failed at exactly the right time to help the invasion. Pure luck. That's what the historian concluded. But it wasn't luck. James Dalton never told anyone what he'd done that night. When he got back to England after the Normandy campaign, nobody asked him about a radar station. Nobody connected one lost paratrooper to a German technical failure 15 miles from his drop zone. He'd violated his orders by attacking the installation. He'd operated outside his mission parameters. If he'd failed, if he'd been captured, it would have been his fault for not following Morrison's advice. So he kept quiet, finished the war, went home to Ohio, went back to being an electrician. Never talked about D-Day except to say he'd jumped with the 101st and fought in Normandy like thousands of other guys. In 1967, Dalton was working on an electrical substation outside Toledo when a young engineer asked him if he'd served in the war. Dalton said yes. The engineer asked if he'd been in any famous battles. Dalton said he'd jumped into Normandy on D-Day. The engineer got excited, said his thesis at MIT had been about the Allied invasion, said one of the mysteries of D-Day was why German radar coverage had failed at such a critical moment. Several installations had technical problems that night, but one in particular had a transformer explosion right before the main airborne landings. Nobody ever figured out why. Dalton listened to the whole story, then said, "Transformers fail sometimes. Bad luck for the Germans, I guess." The engineer agreed. Bad luck, then went back to work. But that night, Dalton told his wife the truth, told her about jumping into the river, finding the radar installation, climbing the fence, short-circuiting the transformer. She asked why he'd never reported it. He said because he'd disobeyed orders, because Morrison had told him not to be a hero and he'd done it anyway, because he got lucky and it worked, but it could easily have gotten him killed for nothing. His wife asked if he thought it mattered, if that one radar station made any difference. Dalton said he didn't know. Maybe it helped, maybe it didn't. The invasion would have succeeded either way. Thousands of men did brave things that day. His contribution was just one small piece of a massive operation. But his wife disagreed. She'd read about D-Day, read about how many paratroopers died when their C-47s got shot down, read about how German anti-aircraft fire had been devastating in some sectors, but strangely ineffective in others. Maybe Dalton's radar station was one of the reasons why. Maybe the gap in German coverage had saved lives. Dalton thought about that. Thought about the C-47s he'd heard flying over after he knocked out the radar. Thought about the paratroopers who'd landed successfully because German gunners couldn't track them accurately. Thought about men who went home to their families because a radar wasn't working when it should have. Ben. Maybe it mattered, maybe it didn't. He'd never know for sure. James Dalton died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, mentioned that he'd been a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne, mentioned that he'd jumped into Normandy on D-Day, didn't mention anything about a radar station. After his death, his wife found a box in the garage. Inside was his old Army uniform, his jump wings, his combat infantryman badge, and a hand-drawn diagram. It showed an electrical transformer with annotations in Dalton's handwriting, notes about how to create a cascading overload, how to make an electrical failure look natural, how to disable a radar installation without using explosives. She donated the box to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The curators cataloged everything, put the uniform on display, put the diagram in the archives, labeled it Electrical Sabotage Techniques, Origin Unknown, circa 1944. They had no idea what it actually represented. In 2003, a researcher at the museum was going through German military records that had been declassified, found the technical report about the radar station failure on June 6, 1944. The report included photographs of the damaged transformer. The damage pattern matched the diagram in Dalton's box exactly. Same configuration, same failure points, same type of overload. The researcher tried to find out more about Dalton, found his service record, found that he'd been reported as missing after the jump, then had showed up at a crossroads 15 miles from his drop zone at 04:20 hours on June 6th. The crossroads was 6 miles west of where the German radar station had been located. The timeline fit, the location fit, the electrical knowledge fit, everything fit. The researcher wrote a paper about it, submitted it to a military history journal. The paper concluded that Private First Class James Dalton had most likely sabotaged a German radar installation on D-Day, creating a gap in German air defense coverage during the critical hours of the airborne landings. The sabotage had probably saved dozens of aircraft and hundreds of lives. The paper was published in 2004. Almost nobody read it. It was too specific, too technical, too focused on one minor incident in a massive operation. But it's in the archives now. The truth is documented. Sometimes the most important actions in war aren't the ones that get reported. Sometimes one guy with the right knowledge in the right place at the right time changes everything. And sometimes that guy never tells anyone because he was just doing what needed to be done. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to like this video. These forgotten histories matter. Subscribe to hear more untold stories from World War II. Real people, real actions, real consequences. And leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you know someone who served. Tell us if you've ever had to make a choice between following orders and doing what seemed right. We read every comment. This community keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching. The full story of what James Dalton did that night didn't come out until 2004. But the effects of what he did were felt immediately on June 6, 1944, even though nobody understood why. At 02:48 hours, when Dalton's grenade detonated inside that transformer building, it created a chain reaction that the German engineers never anticipated. The short circuit caused a massive power surge through the entire electrical system. The transformer's protective breakers should have tripped, should have isolated the fault. But Dalton had positioned his grenade in exactly the right spot to bypass the protection systems. The transformer exploded, the main windings melted, the insulation caught fire, and most critically, The explosion sent a feedback surge through the power distribution network that fried every piece of electronic equipment connected to it. The Würzburg-Riese radar dish was the most sophisticated piece of technology at the installation. It had vacuum tubes, oscillators, receivers, transmitters, delicate electronics that couldn't handle power surges. When the transformer blew, the surge traveled through the power lines and destroyed every vacuum tube in the radar system. The radar didn't just lose power, it was physically destroyed from the inside. The German radar operators didn't realize this immediately. When the lights went out, they assumed it was a simple power failure. They switched to battery backup, tried to restart the system. Nothing happened. They checked circuit breakers, checked connections. Everything looked fine. But the radar was dead. It took them 2 hours to figure out that the radar's electronics were completely fried. By then, it was 0445 hours. The main wave of Allied paratroopers had already landed. The invasion fleet was approaching the beaches, and the Germans had a massive hole in their radar coverage right when they needed it most. The radar station commander, Major Klaus Weber, sent an emergency report to German 7th Army headquarters, reported that his installation was offline due to equipment failure, requested immediate technical support and replacement parts. The response he got back was not helpful. Every German unit in Normandy was reporting problems. Communications were disrupted. Roads were blocked by paratroopers. The entire defensive system was in chaos. Weber's radar problem was low priority. But it wasn't low priority. That radar station was responsible for tracking aircraft over a 40-mile radius. It was supposed to provide early warning to anti-aircraft batteries, supposed to vector night fighters toward Allied bombers, supposed to coordinate defensive fire. Without it, the Germans were fighting blind. At 0520 hours, a formation of 12 C-47 transport aircraft flew directly over the position where the radar station should have detected them. These aircraft were carrying the second wave of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. They were flying at 800 feet, slow and vulnerable, perfect targets for German anti-aircraft guns. The German flak batteries in that sector had standing orders. When the radar detected aircraft, they were supposed to open fire immediately. Coordinated barrage fire, dozens of guns firing together. It was devastatingly effective when it worked properly. But without radar guidance, the flak gunners couldn't see the aircraft in the darkness. They could hear engines, but they couldn't tell exactly where the planes were or how high they were flying. A few guns fired blindly. Most held their fire because they couldn't acquire targets. All 12 C-47s made it through. All 192 paratroopers jumped successfully. 0 aircraft were shot down in that sector during the critical 0500 to 0600 hours time window when the second wave was landing. In other sectors where German radar was still functioning, the results were very different. Between 0500 and 0600 hours, German flak batteries shot down 21 C-47s in areas where radar coverage was working. Over 200 paratroopers died in those aircraft. The sector covered by the radar station that Dalton destroyed had 0 losses. Nobody connected these facts at the time. The invasion was chaos. Thousands of things were happening simultaneously. Aircraft were being shot down in some places and getting through in others. Paratroopers were scattered across 50 miles of Norman countryside. Commanders were trying to piece together what was happening from fragmentary reports and radio traffic. But the statistics were clear in hindsight. The sector with the dead radar had significantly lower aircraft losses and higher paratrooper survival rates than adjacent sectors. The gap in German radar coverage had saved lives. Lieutenant Heinrich Vogel was the senior radar operator at the installation. He was 28 years old, trained engineer, had been operating radar systems since 1981. He'd worked on systems in Germany, Poland, and France. He knew the equipment inside and out. When the transformer exploded, Vogel was inside the radar control room. He saw every indicator light go dark simultaneously, felt the building shake from the explosion. His first thought was that they'd been hit by a bomb, but there'd been no air raid warning, no sound of aircraft, just an explosion from the transformer building. Vogel ran outside with a flashlight, found the transformer building on fire, found the transformer destroyed, looked at the damage pattern and immediately knew something was wrong. Transformers failed sometimes, but they didn't explode like this. This looked like deliberate sabotage. He reported his suspicion to Major Weber. Weber ordered a security sweep of the installation. German guards searched everywhere, found the open window at the transformer building, found boot prints in the mud outside, found evidence that someone had climbed the fence and gotten inside the perimeter. Weber sent another report to 7th Army headquarters, this time reporting possible sabotage, requested security reinforcements and a technical investigation. The response was the same as before. Every German unit was reporting sabotage and partisan activity. Weber's situation was not unique. Deal with it locally. Vogel spent the next 6 hours trying to salvage the radar system. He pulled vacuum tubes, tested them, found that every single one was burned out. The power surge had destroyed them all. He'd need replacement parts that didn't exist anywhere in France. The radar was beyond repair with available resources. By noon on June 6th, it was clear that the Allied invasion was succeeding. The beaches were secured. Thousands of troops were ashore. The German defensive system had failed to stop the landings. And one small piece of that failure was the gap in radar coverage that had existed from 0248 to 0900 hours in a critical sector. Vogel wrote a detailed technical report about the transformer failure, included his analysis that it was probably sabotage, described the damage pattern, recommended improved security procedures for radar installations. The report went into German military files and was captured by Allied forces in 1945. That report sat in archives for 58 years before the researcher found it and connected it to James Dalton's diagram. The question that nobody could answer was how one American paratrooper, lost and alone, with minimal equipment and no explosives, had managed to disable a heavily defended German radar installation. How had he even found it? How had he known what to sabotage? How had he known exactly where to place a grenade to cause maximum damage to an electrical system? The answer was in Dalton's background. He wasn't just a paratrooper. He was an electrician who understood power systems. He'd worked on transformers before the war. He knew that you didn't need to blow up a transformer to kill it. You just needed to create the right kind of short circuit in the right place. The transformer would destroy itself. That knowledge, combined with extraordinary luck and timing, had put Dalton in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to do something that nobody had planned, nobody had ordered, and nobody had expected. After the war, the U.S. Army analyzed D-Day operations extensively. They studied what worked and what didn't. They tried to understand why some sectors had been easier to secure than others. They looked at German defensive responses and tried to identify weaknesses. One of the things they noticed was the gap in German radar coverage during the early morning hours of June 6th. They attributed it to successful pre-invasion bombing of radar sites. The Air Force had flown missions against German radar installations for weeks before D-Day. Some had been destroyed, some had been damaged. The assumption was that the radar gaps were results of those bombing missions. Nobody checked carefully enough to realize that one of the radar gaps hadn't been caused by bombing. It had been caused by a private with a grenade and knowledge of electrical systems. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, veterans of the 101st Airborne gathered for a reunion in Normandy. James Dalton attended. He was 63 years old by then, retired, living quietly in Ohio. He walked the beaches with other veterans, visited the American cemetery, stood at the memorials. During a group discussion, someone asked if anyone had interesting stories from the jump that they'd never told. Several men shared stories about being scattered, lost, fighting in small groups, standard paratrooper experiences from that chaotic night. Dalton almost spoke up, almost told them about the radar station, but then he thought about Morrison's advice. Don't try to be a hero. He'd violated that advice. He'd gotten lucky. If he'd failed, if he'd been killed, it would have been his own fault for not following orders. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a guy who'd made a risky decision that happened to work out. So he stayed quiet. Let the moment pass. Never told the story. But one veteran at that reunion, a man named Robert Hayes, who'd been a C-47 pilot, told a story that stuck with Dalton. Hayes said his aircraft had been in the second wave, coming in at 5:30 hours. He'd expected heavy flak. The briefing had warned him about intense anti-aircraft fire in his sector. But when he flew over his drop zone, there was almost no flak. A few scattered shots. Nothing serious. All his paratroopers jumped successfully. He brought his aircraft home without damage. Hayes said he'd always wondered why the German defenses had been so light in his sector when other sectors got hammered. He'd concluded it was just luck. Random chance. Dalton listened to that story and realized that Hayes had probably flown directly over the sector covered by the radar station he'd destroyed. The reason Hayes hadn't taken heavy flak was because the German guns had no radar guidance. They'd been shooting blind. Dalton had saved Hayes, had saved the 12 paratroopers on Hayes's aircraft, had saved the crews of 11 other C-47s that flew through that sector that morning. Maybe 150 men total, maybe more. And Hayes had no idea. Would never know, would go to his grave thinking he'd just been lucky. Dalton thought about telling him, thought about explaining what had actually happened. But Hayes looked happy believing it was luck. Why take that away from him? Why make it complicated? So Dalton shook Hayes's hand, said he was glad Hayes made it home safe, told him it was an honor to serve with men like him. And that was enough. The truth about the radar station didn't change what had happened. The men who survived because of it had lived full lives whether they knew why or not. The war had been won. The mission had succeeded. Dalton's individual contribution was a tiny piece of a massive effort. It mattered, but it only mattered because thousands of other men had done their jobs too. That's the reality of war. Individual heroism exists, but it's meaningless without the collective effort. Dalton could sabotage every radar in France, but if the men on the beaches didn't fight, if the sailors didn't get them ashore, if the pilots didn't fly support missions, none of it would matter. James Dalton understood that. He'd been one small part of something much larger than himself. He'd done what needed doing in the moment he was in. That was enough. When the researcher published the paper in 2004, connecting Dalton to the radar sabotage, a few military history enthusiasts read it. A few people posted about it online, but it never became widely known. The story was too small, too specific, buried in the larger narrative of D-Day, which is probably how Dalton would have wanted it. The researcher tried to contact Dalton's family, found out he'd died in 1998, talked to his widow. She confirmed that her husband had told her about destroying a German radar station on D-Day. She still had the diagram he'd drawn. She was glad someone had finally documented what happened, said her husband would have been embarrassed by the attention, but pleased that the truth was recorded. The National World War II Museum added a small notation to Dalton's display. Mentioned that research suggests he may have sabotaged a German radar installation on D-Day, used careful language. May have instead of did, because there's no official documentation, no after-action report, no witness statements, just circumstantial evidence and one man's private diagram. But the evidence is strong enough that historians who study D-Day operations now include Dalton's action in their analyses. They talk about how small, unplanned actions can have outsized impacts, how individual initiative matters, how one soldier with specific knowledge and courage can change outcomes. That's the lesson. Not that James Dalton was a unique hero, but that every soldier has the potential to do something that matters if they're in the right place with the right skills at the right time. Most never get that opportunity. Dalton did, and he made the choice to act. That choice, made by one wet, lost, scared 23-year-old paratrooper in the darkness of occupied France, saved lives, created gaps in German defenses, contributed to the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history. And he never asked for credit, never sought recognition, just went home, went back to work, and lived his life knowing he'd done something that mattered. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video. These stories need to be told. Subscribe to this channel for more untold histories from World War II. Real people who did extraordinary things without expecting anything in return. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if this story resonated with you. Tell us if you know other forgotten stories that deserve to be remembered. We read every comment. This community keeps history alive. Thank you for watching. And thank you for remembering the people who made history without making headlines.